Hello. I want to thank you so very much for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. Back in February of 1995, I was fresh out of college and I was offered the opportunity to work as the youth minister with a church in Sheffield, Alabama. One day I was in my office and the phone rang and I answered it, and our secretary said there was somebody on the other line who really needed to talk to one of our ministers, but since our preaching minister was out on a mission trip, they just guessed I would be okay. So I answered the phone and I discovered that the person on the other line, they were looking for someone to do a graveside funeral for their dad. Now I had been to funerals, but I had never spoken at one. Yet I just agreed, whatever I can do to help you out, just let me know what I can do. And I was wondering, could we meet together so I could learn a little bit more about the gentleman who passed away? The lady on the other side said, there's no need for us to get together and meet. Just show up at the cemetery, say something nice, and be short. So on the day of the funeral, I went out to the graveside and there was about 20 people there. There were 8 people sitting in chairs, and a little bit behind them, there were 12 men standing, dressed in black suits, wearing sunglasses. Now, I to this day don't remember what I said, but what I do remember is that after the service, every one of those 12 men that were standing up in the dark suits walked up and thanked me for what I said by shaking my hand. And as they shook my hand, they palmed me some money. Every time they did, I just took the money and stuck it in my pocket and said, "You're welcome. I was glad to be able to help." Well, in a moment like clockwork, all of those folks got into black limousines and drove off. They left me at the cemetery. So I walked to the car, put my hand in my pocket, and discovered that they had given me 12 $100 bills. That was more money than I would make in the next 6 months. For the last 29 years, I've had lots of memorable experiences that have taken place at funerals. There was a time that we were living in Gainesville, Georgia, and I was speaking at a funeral, and everything was going to plan. And after the service, we made our way to the cemetery for the graveside. I got in my car and followed the hearse to the cemetery like I was supposed to. I got out, I walked in front of the casket to the graveside like I was supposed to. And when we got there, I stepped on some astroturf and fell in. Well, not all the way in the grave. Luckily, there was a tombstone close enough that I caught it and kept myself from falling all the way in, but far enough down into the hole that I had to preach the rest of the service with a right leg covered in mud up to my thigh. And then there was the time that I was at a funeral home within 200 miles of Anniston, and this particular funeral home had a curtain in their parlor. Their practice was that after the viewing, they would pull the curtain closed, the family could come in, say their last goodbyes, then they would shut the casket, open the curtain, and we would begin the funeral. But on this particular day, one of the daughters made the decision that their mom was going to be buried with her wedding ring on. But it seems like the other daughter either didn't know about that decision or didn't agree with it, and she wanted mom's wedding ring. So before the funeral director closed the casket, daughter number 2 reaches in to get mom's wedding ring. And when daughter number 1 sees what's happening, she tries to physically stop her sister, which created a small skirmish. And one of them bumped into the casket, knocking it off of its pedestal, and their mom fell out of the casket onto the floor. I've been to and spoken at a lot of funerals. Some funerals had hundreds of people in it, and I preached a funeral one time where it was just me, the body, and the remaining daughter of the lady that was being remembered that day. It's part of the job description. Ministers are supposed to cast a vision, baptize sinners, marry lovers, and bury the dead. Maybe that's why I've spent so much time thinking about my own funeral. I asked Trista if she would let me preach the service. Not live, mind you. I just wanted to pre record the service like the sermon because, I mean, who knows me better than me? I could preach the sermon and everybody would know that I said exactly what needed to be said. Nobody lied. I could tell the stories that I want told. I also want my funeral to be catered by Big Bob Gibson's barbecue restaurant. That way, people could invite their friends and share one great meal together, thinking about the life that we had. I even know what I want on my tombstone. Jeremy Clay Hauk, born July 9th, 1973. Died? Never. Just transferred to the home office. And at the end of the service, I want the song Going Home played as everybody leaves the building. The very first time I ever heard that song, I looked at Trista and said, that's going to be my funeral song. I don't have any specific date in mind. I just want you to know when it happens, this is what I want. And I also think that there are probably some people watching right now that are a little uncomfortable with me sharing these stories and talking about death so casually. I would imagine that because the culture that we live in is growing more and more afraid of death, that we're not very comfortable talking about it. I've mentioned before that there were a time when all of our homes had a room we called the parlor. It served two purposes. First, if somebody came over for a visit and we didn't really know them, we would sit in the parlor and talk. But the second purpose was it was the place where families would bring in the deceased bodies of their family members and they would sit up with them through the nights. But we don't do that anymore. We now have professionals to deal with the things that make us uncomfortable. Truthfully, I don't really care what you do at my funeral. I'm not going to be there. So I just want you to do whatever's going to help Trista and the boys. I mean, that's what funerals are for anyway, aren't they? Not the people that have died, but the people that are left. Actually, unless Jesus comes back to get his bride, every one of us are going to have a funeral. We have to go through the funeral so we can get to the other side. And I'm often encouraged by the thought that heaven is a place where there's going to be no pain, no sorrow, no heartache, because I've had plenty of that living here on earth. I'm trying to live my life so that when I'm done here, I can go on to eternal bliss. And I understand that my job between now and then is to love people so deeply that I have lived a life that's worth celebrating. That's probably a long enough introduction. So let's just go ahead and get into our text for this morning from Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything is worthy of praise, dwell on these things. I imagine the reason that I told you all of those stories about funerals is because there's going to come a day that our lives are all going to be over. And the people who are left here get to make the decision on how we are remembered. Did we live our lives in such a way that we made life better or more difficult for others? Did we live our lives in such a way that we were a blessing or a curse? Was our life made up of one tragedy after the next, or were we able to find peace in the midst of all of the chaos in our world? Paul understood that we have this need and this desire to live a life of peace and joy. So he establishes these boundaries for us. And we discovered today that if we want to find the freedom that we were created to enjoy, we must live our lives meditating on things that are excellent. I doubt most people have this unending desire to just be average or worse. Most of us want to come to the end of our lives and we want to be recognized for our accomplishments. We want people to remember how well we loved them or cared for them. We want people to remember how welcomed they felt in our presence or how we helped them have a better family, a better marriage, a better life. We want to live an excellent life. C.H. Spurgeon said it this way: an excellent character is the best tombstone. Those who loved you and were helped by you will remember you, so carve your name on their hearts, not on marble. While we all understand that excellence is a good thing, we seem to struggle knowing what that really looks like. What does it look like to live a life meditating on whatever is excellent? Meditating on excellent things doesn't mean that we get the biggest paycheck or we move up the company ladder quicker than our contemporaries. Meditating on excellence doesn't have anything to do with our brilliant minds or our athletic prowess. Thinking about what's excellent means that we live every day thinking about the end of our lives. When we think about what's excellent, we live with the end in mind. And when I do that, I don't have to concern myself with what you or anybody else thinks about me, because the only opinion in my life that matters is God's opinion. And God believes that I have more value than anything else that was created in this world. When I live my life thinking about what's excellent, then really what you have to say about me doesn't matter, because the only voice that I long to hear is the voice of my Father, who calls me loved and his blessed child. When I meditate on what's excellent, I find myself longing to live my life in light of my Father. The Bible often talks about people who meditated on excellent things: Abraham, Joseph, David, John the Baptist, the Apostle Paul. All of these men lived their lives with the end in mind. But today I want us to look at another story that stands out as an example of someone being found thinking about the excellent things. Ever since God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, he tried to foster a relationship with them where they could find their identity in him. What we discover is that over and over, the children of Israel, they don't have a knowledge problem. God constantly reveals himself to him. His presence is constantly felt in their community as they wander through the wilderness, as they capture the promised land, as they establish their nation. We discover that what they have is a heart problem. Their refusal to think about what is excellent keeps them from becoming the nation and the people that God designed them to be. Yet we discover God's undeterred. He sends prophets, he sends judges in an effort to get them to focus on the thing that really matters. God wants them to live their lives with the end in mind, but they continue to just drift away from God, following the culture. So God makes the decision that since they refuse to listen to the prophets, they won't listen to the judges, he's going to have to do something else to get their attention. After decades of warning them, God allows the Babylonians to capture the city of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, takes every Israelite man that was wise, good looking, intelligent, possessed understanding. He takes them from Jerusalem and he brings them into his court in Babylonia. We discover in the first chapter of Daniel that four of the men that were captured and taken from their homes were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know David's Hebrew name. You're probably more familiar with the other three's Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. For 3 years, these four men were taught the language and the literature of the Babylonians. They were offered the best food from the king's table. They trained in the art of understanding visions and dreams. After 3 years, each one of them were taken for a personal interview in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, where he could decide if they were worthy to stay in his court or if they needed to be dismissed. Daniel chapter 1 ends by sharing that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were found to be far superior than all of the other young men. Nobody was a match for the four Israelite boys. They were given a position in the king's service, and whenever the king consulted them on anything, books, dreams, life, they were 10 times better than any other magician or enchanter in the entire country or nation of Babylon. When we get to chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a disturbing dream. So he calls some magicians and enchanters and he asks them to interpret the dream. But there's a catch. He says, I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. You have to tell me the dream and tell me the meaning of the dream. And if you can't, then I'm going to have you torn limb from limb and your houses are going to lay in ruins. The magicians, well, they're afraid and they ask Nebuchadnezzar for more time, but he says, you guys are just stalling. And he orders that all of the magicians and all of the enchanters are to be put to death. When the guard shows up at Daniel's house to arrest him, he has no idea what's happening. And when he finds out about the death decree, he asks for permission to go speak with Nebuchadnezzar one last time. So David goes and asks Nebuchadnezzar, if you'll give me just a little time to figure out the dream and what it means, I'll interpret it for you. And then he goes to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and asks them to pray and to plead to God for mercy and to reveal the mystery. That very night, God not only reveals Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, he provides the interpretation. The next morning, Daniel goes to the king and tells him, "This is the dream that you had. This is what it means." And if we pick up the text in Daniel 2:46, we read, "Then Nebuchadnezzar threw himself down before Daniel and worshipped him. And he commanded his people to offer sacrifices and burnt sweet incense before him. The king said to Daniel, 'Truly, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret.'" Because Daniel's mind was concerned with whatever is excellent, we find a non believing Babylonian king was led to worship and praise Yahweh, our God. It's a story that plays out over and over. In Daniel chapter 3, we find out that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown in the fiery furnace. Maybe it's because of the dream in chapter 2, but we discover Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge golden statue of himself, and he commands that everybody bow down to worship the statue. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse. Nebuchadnezzar goes into this rage and demands that they're not only thrown into the fiery furnace, but that the furnace is stoked to be 7 times hotter than its normal temperature. It's so hot when the guards go to throw the 3 boys into the furnace, the guards get burned up by the heat. But we discover in the text, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not only do they not get burned up, their clothes don't even smell like smoke. And chapter 3 ends. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted him. They defiled the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Once again, we discover these 3 Hebrew boys are willing to meditate on whatever is excellent. And the result is a non believing Babylonian king is led to worship and to praise God. In Daniel 6, there's a new king in Babylon, King Darius, and he recognizes his need to get people to help govern this large territory. So he designates 120 government officials to watch over the land, and he places 3 governors to watch over the officials. Daniel is one of those 3 governors. We read in verse 3 that Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers because of Daniel's excellent spirit. The king made plans to place him over the entire empire. As you might imagine, this created a little power struggle among the government officials and governors. They're jealous of this foreigner, that Daniel is getting recognition and power. And if you listen carefully, you can hear their spirit of entitlement. How dare King Darius think about promoting Daniel over us? We've been working here longer. Daniel wasn't even born here. He's a foreigner. And while that might be true, they were thinking like the culture thinks. They wanted to make a name for themselves, they wanted to get ahead. Daniel is living with the end in mind. He's focusing on what is excellent. We discover the other governors are not only jealous, but they immediately try to find some dirt on Daniel, some reason to have him humiliated and disqualified. The issue is that Daniel is always thinking about what's excellent, so there's no dirt to find on him. And since they couldn't find any dirt, they just moved to part 2 of their plan. They set a trap. They knew that Daniel was faithful to God. All they had to do was to convince King Darius to make a law that would conflict with Daniel's faith. And so they go to Darius, and after an awful lot of flattery, they get him to make a law that says for the next 30 days, everyone must pray to him as their God. And if anyone prays to any other God, they're going to be thrown into the den of lions. Daniel has a decision to make. Do I continue to follow God, or do I cheapen my faith in order to save my life? And it doesn't seem like Daniel had to think about it very long. Remember, when you're focused on whatever is excellent, you know the only opinion that matters is the opinion of God, our Heavenly Father. So when Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted around the city, he continued to pray just like he'd always done. His house had windows in the upstairs that opened up towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he would kneel in front of those windows in prayer, thanking and praising God. And the government officials, they're standing out in the street and they're watching, ready to spring their trap. When Daniel prays, they immediately go to King Darius and say, Daniel's broken the law. He needs to be thrown into the lion's den. Now, Darius respects Daniel. He doesn't want to throw him in the lion's den, but because this is a law, he doesn't have a choice. Daniel is arrested. He's dragged out of his home to the lion's den where he's thrown in. They place a stone on top of it, and Darius seals the den with a signet ring. This is securing Daniel's death, his fate. That night, King Darius paces around the halls of his palace, and as soon as the sun comes up, he goes out to the lion's den and he calls out Daniel's name, just hoping that maybe Daniel survived. Can you imagine his relief when Daniel answered, My God sent his angel who closed the mouths of the lions so they wouldn't hurt me? And once again, we read starting in verse 26. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. We discover once again that because Daniel's mind is concerned with whatever is excellent, we have another Babylonian king who's led to worship and to praise God. When we linger, meditate, and think about the things that are excellent, we live our lives dwelling about the end of life. And that's probably the most freeing boundary that Paul established. The problem is, far too many of us have bought into the lies of our culture, and for us, death feels like we're being forced to leave a party before it's over. Instead of finding the hope and the freedom by meditating on heaven and God, we walk around disappointed, thinking about all the people and all the things that we're going to miss once we leave. There's a study out of Harvard that shows a direct connection between long term thinking and success. What they discovered is that most people focus on short term goals. And the more we focus on short term goals, the more likely we are to fail. Short term goals are usually centered around what feels good or what I want right now. But people who choose to focus on long term goals, when they focus on what they really want the most, they're more likely to find success and fulfillment in this life. That's why when we gather at the tables, we're being invited to think about long term. We take the bread and the cup, we're not looking forward to something that's going to happen in 40 years or even 50 years. We're thinking about eternity. When we live with eternity in mind, we find the strength and the courage to deal with all the momentary problems that continue to come our way. When we keep our minds focused on what's excellent, we're protected from temptation because we keep our hearts focused on what pleases God. So, as we gather at the tables today, we're being invited to dwell on things that are excellent so that the day that we're called home, we'll get to be with the one who makes life worth living. I really hope that today, as you sit down and you take the bread and the cup, you're able to think about what is excellent. What are some long term things? How do you want the world to remember you when you go home to eternity? Because the way that you live right now should be focused on the things that are excellent, so that not only will others be encouraged to worship the God of the heavens, but that one day you'll be able to stand at his throne and be able to see God face to face. I hope you have a wonderful week. Never forget how deeply you're loved. And I look forward to seeing you very soon.